Hello, boring dreamers. Today, we are going to open the lid on a barrel of bubbling, funky history to answer a question that might save your life if the power grid ever goes down. Why could a medieval peasant eat a 3-year-old sausage and live while you throw out a can of beans the day after it expires? We are going to dive into the slimy, smelly, and surprisingly scientific world of medieval food preservation, where survival meant turning your pantry into a controlled science experiment. You see the pristine rows of jars in a modern supermarket, but let's be honest, you probably won't survive this. Not because of the starvation, but because your gut biome would terrifyingly surrender the moment it met a piece of authentic 14th century cheese. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, go ahead and let me know in the comments where you're re-watching from and what time it is there. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You are standing in the center of your cottage, and the air is thick with the smell of damp wool and wood smoke. It is late October. The Feast of All Hallows is approaching, and the world outside is dying. The vibrant green of summer has faded into the wet brown sludge of autumn. The harvest is in. The wheat is threshed, the barley is stored, and the pigs have been fattened on the last of the forest acorns. To a modern eye, this looks like abundance. Your larder is full. There are sacks of grain, baskets of apples, and piles of root vegetables. You feel a sense of security, a cozy autumn vibes feeling that would fit right in on an Instagram feed. But you shouldn't feel cozy. You should feel terrified, because you are looking at a ticking clock. Every single item in this room is trying to rot. From the moment a carrot is pulled from the earth or a pig is slaughtered, nature begins the process of reclaiming it. Enzymes start to break down cell walls. Mold spores invisible and ubiquitous land on the moist surfaces and begin to bloom. Bacteria are multiplying exponentially, turning your precious calories into a toxic sludge. You don't know what bacteria or enzymes are. You won't know for another 500 years. To you, rot is a curse, a miasma, or perhaps the work of mischievous spirits. But you know the consequence. If this food rots, you don't just get hungry, you die. You are staring down the barrel of the hunger gap. A mainstream historical fact you should know is that the most dangerous time of year for a medieval peasant was at the depth of winter. It was the late spring, specifically May and June. This period was known as the hunger gap. It was the time when the winter stores had run out, but the new crops hadn't yet grown. It was a mathematical valley of death. If you didn't preserve enough food in October to last until July, you would starve to death surrounded by green fields and singing birds. The preservation game isn't about having snacks for December. It's about having life insurance for May. You pick up a turnip. It feels heavy, cold, and solid. It is life. But you know that in a week, it will be soft. In 2 weeks, it will be slimy. In a month, it will be liquid. You have no refrigerator. You have no freezer. You have no vacuum sealer. You have no canning jars. The temperature inside your cottage is roughly the same as the temperature outside, and dampness is your constant roommate. So, how do you stop the inevitable march of decay? You have to declare war. But since you can't fight the rot with technology, you have to fight it with biology. You have to recruit an army of tiny, invisible allies to occupy your food before the enemy does. You are about to become a master of fermentation. Fermentation is, essentially, controlled spoilage. It is the art of letting food go bad in a very specific, safe way so that it doesn't go bad in a dangerous way. You are going to create an environment that kills the pathogens, the things that kill you, but creates a paradise for the probiotics, the things that pickle the food. You look at the wooden barrel in the corner. It is your most important tool. It isn't just a container. It is a fortress. You are going to fill it with cabbage or meat or cucumbers. And you are going to manipulate the environment inside that barrel to favor one specific type of life. Lactobacillus. These bacteria are your best friends. They eat sugar and poop out lactic acid. Why does that matter? Because acid is a preservative. Most of the nasty bacteria that cause botulism, salmonella, and gangrene cannot survive in an acidic environment. By encouraging the lactobacillus to take over, you are turning your food into a biological weapon against rot. This brings us to a fascinating scholarly debate: the germ theory versus experience argument. Historians still argue whether medieval people understood that dirt caused disease, or if they just followed rituals that happened to work. Did they wash the barrel with boiling water because they knew it killed bugs, or because their grandmother told them bad spirits hate hot water? Most evidence suggests it was a mix of trial and error evolution. Communities that figured out the right salt-to-water ratio survived. Communities that didn't, well, they aren't your ancestors. You are the descendant of the best fermenters. You walk over to the table where a side of pork is lying. It was a pig named Bessie yesterday. Now it is meat, and it is already turning gray. You feel a spike of urgency. You need to act now. You don't have a textbook. You have oral tradition. You hear your mother's voice in your head. Salt pulls the water. Water brings the rot. It's a simple rhyme, but it explains the complex principle of osmosis better than a chemistry lecture. You reach for a sack of salt. It is coarse, gray, and incredibly valuable. You treat it with reverence. You aren't just seasoning the meat. You are mummifying it. You are about to engage in the first step of preservation: dehydration. But before you start rubbing the salt in, you notice something on the rind of the cheese sitting on the shelf. A blue fuzz. A quirky, fringe tidbit about medieval preservation is the concept of St. Anthony's fire. This was a horrific disease caused by eating rye bread infected with the ergot fungus, Claviceps purpurea. It caused hallucinations, burning sensations in the limbs, and eventually gangrene. Its preservation went wrong. It didn't just taste bad. It caused mass hysteria. Entire villages would go mad, convinced they were bewitched, simply because the grain in the silo got a little too damp. You eye the bread suspiciously. Preservation is a high-stakes game of Russian roulette. You take a deep breath. The smell of the raw meat. You stand over the slab of pork, your hands hovering like a surgeon's, but your tool is a handful of coarse, gray crystals. This is salt. In the modern world, salt is the cheapest thing in the grocery store. You toss it over your shoulder for luck. You sprinkle it on popcorn without thinking. But here, in the medieval cottage, salt is currency. It is white gold. It is the only thing standing between you and starvation. You grab a handful from the clay pot. It feels sharp and jagged against your skin. This isn't the free-flowing, iodized powder of the future. This is bay salt, harvested from the sea by evaporation, or rock salt, mined from the earth. It is chunky, uneven, and full of minerals that give it a dirty, grayish hue. You press the salt into the flesh of the pig. You push hard. You aren't seasoning a steak. You are massaging a corpse. You have to work the crystals deep into the muscle fibers, around the bone, and into every crevice where a fly might have laid an egg. Scritch scratch. The sound of the salt grinding against the meat is gritty and satisfying. But then, you find a small cut on your thumb, a souvenir from the harvest knife. The salt hits the wound. Sting. The pain is blinding for a second. A sharp, white-hot electric shock that makes you hiss through your teeth. But you don't stop. You can't stop. That stinging pain is actually a lesson in chemistry. The salt is dehydrating your cells, pulling the water out of your nerves, sending a distress signal to your brain. And that is exactly what it is going to do to the bacteria. A mainstream historical fact you should know is that salt works through the process of osmosis. Nature loves equilibrium. When you cover a piece of meat in salt, you create a hypertonic environment. The concentration of salt outside the bacteria cells is vastly higher than the concentration inside. To balance this out, the water inside the bacteria rushes out through their cell walls. The result? The bacteria literally desiccate. They shrivel up and die of thirst while drowning in a sea of brine. You are killing the rot by sucking it dry. Shutterstock. You continue to rub the salt into the ham. You see beads of moisture starting to form on the surface of the meat. It's working. The salt is already drawing out the blood water. This liquid is dangerous. It's the highway for pathogens. You have to keep adding salt until the meat stops weeping. This brings us to a quirky fringe tidbit. The salt tax riots. Because salt was so vital for survival, governments loved to tax it. In France, the gabelle, salt tax, was so hated that people were forced to buy a certain amount of salt every year, whether they needed it or not, just to generate revenue. Smuggling salt became a major industry. Peasant women would sew secret pockets into their petticoats to hide bags of illicit, tax-free salt. You are rubbing contraband into your dinner. You flip the meat over. It is heavy, dead weight. You pack it into a wooden box, creating a layer of salt at the bottom, and the meat, then another layer of salt on top. You are burying it. This technique is called dry curing. Over the next few weeks, the salt will penetrate to the center of the ham. It will change the texture of the proteins, making them dense and translucent. It will turn the red meat into a dark mahogany color. But there is a risk. If you miss a spot, if an air pocket remains near the bone, the salt won't reach it. The bacteria will survive in that tiny protected bunker. They will breed. And the rot will start from... You turn your attention to the mound of cucumbers. They are piled on the wooden table, green and lumpy, looking innocent enough. But you know the truth. Inside each one is a ticking time bomb of water and sugar. If you leave them there, the mold will find them. They will turn into a brown, leaking mush that smells like a compost heap within days. To save them, you have to drown them. You grab a heavy earthenware crock. It's cool to the touch, glazed on the inside to make it watertight. You aren't going to cook these cucumbers. You aren't going to seal them in a vacuum. You are going to practice the ancient art of pickling, but not in the way a modern supermarket shopper understands it. In the 21st century, a pickle is a cucumber that has been murdered by boiling vinegar. You take a jar, fill it with sterile vinegar, acetic acid, boil the life out of the vegetable to kill all bacteria, and seal it. It's a sterile corpse floating in acid. But you, the medieval peasant, don't have gallons of cheap distilled vinegar lying around. Vinegar is precious. It's what happens when your wine goes bad, and you drink your wine. You don't waste it on vegetables. So you have to make the cucumbers create their own acid. This is lactofermentation. You start by making a brine. You fetch water from the well, hoping it's clean, and pour it into a bucket. Then you add the salt. How much? You don't have a kitchen scale. You don't have a measuring cup. You use the egg test. A quirky fringe tidbit about medieval measurement is the use of a fresh chicken egg as a hydrometer. You drop a raw egg into the bucket of water. If it sinks, there isn't enough salt. You keep adding salt and stirring until the egg floats just enough so that a patch of shell the size of a coin breaks the surface. That is the perfect salinity, roughly 5%. Enough to kill the bad bacteria, but not enough to kill the lactobacillus. You pack the cucumbers into the crock. You jam them in tight. You throw in some dill from the garden, maybe a clove of garlic if you're feeling fancy, and a handful of mustard seeds. Then you pour the brine over them. But here is the critical part. You have to keep them submerged. If a single tip of a cucumber pokes above the surface of the brine, it meets the air. Air contains oxygen. Oxygen invites mold. Mold ruins the batch. So you find a flat rock. You scrub it clean, mostly. You place it on top of the cucumbers to weigh them down, forcing them under the surface. You are creating an anaerobic, oxygen-free environment. You cover the crock with a cloth to keep out the flies and push it into the dark corner of the room. Now you wait. Inside the crock, a microscopic war is beginning. The salt kills the spoilage bacteria immediately. The environment is quiet for a day or two. Then the survivors emerge. The lactobacillus bacteria, which are naturally present on the skin of the cucumber from the soil, look around and say, "Hey, there's no oxygen here, but there is plenty of sugar inside these green things." They start to eat the sugars in the cucumber and excrete lactic acid. You will know it's working when you check the crock in 3 days. You lift the cloth. The brine is no longer clear. It is cloudy, milky white. And it is bubbling. Bloop. A single bubble of carbon dioxide rises to the surface. Then another. The crock is alive. It is gently simmering without heat. This is controlled decomposition. The cucumbers are rotting, technically, but they are rotting into acid. As the acid level rises, the pH drops. Once it hits about 4.6, it becomes a biological kill zone for anything nasty, like Clostridium botulinum. A mainstream historical fact you should know is that fermented vegetables were the primary source of vitamin C for Northern Europeans during the winter. Scurvy was a real killer. Fresh fruit was unavailable from November to May, but fermentation actually preserves vitamin C better than cooking or drying. In fact, the bacterial action can sometimes create new B vitamins. That cloudy, funky pickle juice is a nutritional super serum. But there is a problem with pickles: texture. Over time, the enzymes in the cucumber can turn the vegetable into a hollow, soggy mush. Nobody wants a squishy pickle. So you reach for a secret ingredient. You walk to the oak tree outside and pick a few leaves. Or maybe some grape leaves if you're further south. You toss them into the crock. This brings us to a fascinating scholarly debate: the tannin intuition. Did medieval people know what tannins were? No, but they knew that if they added oak leaves, horseradish leaves, or cherry leaves to the pickle barrel, the pickles stayed crisp. Modern science tells us that the tannins in the leaves inhibit the enzymes that break down the cell walls of the cucumber. It's natural structural reinforcement. You are essentially tanning the skin of the cucumber like leather. You watch the bubbles rise. The smell coming from the crock is changing. It isn't the sweet smell of fresh vegetables anymore. It is sharp, sour, and funky. To a modern nose, it might smell off. To you, it smells like safety. If you were to open a jar of modern supermarket pickles, they would taste of sharp vinegar and sugar. If you fish a cucumber out of your medieval crock in 2 weeks, it will taste completely different. It will be salty, deeply savory, umami, and have a complex, mellow sourness that tingles on the tongue. It will be fizzy on the tongue, effervescent with the life of the bacteria. You are cultivating a pet that you will eventually eat. But not everything goes into the brine. Brine is heavy. You can't carry a crock of pickles in your pocket. You need something portable. You need something that provides energy. You need the staff of life. You look at the sack of flour in the corner. Wheat, rye, barley. It is dry, which is good. Dry things don't rot. But you can't eat raw flour. You have to transform it. You could just mix it with water and bake it into a flat cracker. That would last forever. Ship's biscuits lasted for decades because they were essentially bricks. But you don't want a brick. You want bread. You want fluffy, risen, soft bread. To get that, you need another invisible ally. You need something that makes the dough rise. You need yeast. But you can't go to the store and buy a packet of Fleischmann's instant yeast. That won't be invented until the 19th century. You have to catch the yeast from the air. You wipe your brine-soaked hands on your apron and turn to the sack of flour standing in the corner. It is slumped against the wall like a sleeping drunkard. Inside is the result of a year's worth of plowing, sowing, reaping, and threshing, stone-ground wheat or rye. In its dry, powdered form, flour is immortal. As long as you keep the rats and the weevils out, it will sit there for years, inert and safe. But you can't eat powder. You need to turn it into bread. Here is the problem. Once you add water to flour to make dough, you have started a countdown. Wet dough is a Petri dish. If you just leave it there, it will grow fuzzy green mold within days. If you bake it immediately without leavening, you get a hardtack biscuit that could crack the very teeth you were trying so hard to preserve. You want a loaf that is soft, digestible, and crucially resistant to rot for more than a day. To get that, you need to perform a magic trick. You need to summon a spirit into the dough. You grab a wooden bowl that you never wash. This is important. In the modern world, a dirty bowl is a health hazard. In your kitchen, a dirty bowl is a biological archive. The wood is porous, and living in those microscopic pores are the ghosts of loaves past. You mix a handful of flour and a splash of water into a thick, sticky paste, and then ... you do nothing. You cover it with a cloth and set it near the hearth, where the air is warm. You are setting a trap. You are waiting for the wild yeast. A mainstream historical fact you should know is that commercial baker as yeast, Saccharomyces cerevisiae, in a pure, isolated form, is a 19th century invention. Before the Victorian era, every single loaf of bread eaten by humanity was a sourdough. The air around you, the skin of the wheat berries, and even your own hands are covered in microscopic fungal spores. By leaving the wet paste out, you are inviting these spores to move in. But yeast isn't the only thing moving in. If it were just yeast, you'd get alcohol and a rise. But you also get bacteria specifically, our old friends, the lactobacillus. This is the sourdough symbiosis. In a modern packet of yeast, you have a monoculture 1 strain of fungus designed to work fast. In your medieval bowl, you have a chaotic ecosystem. The yeast eats the carbohydrates and burps out carbon dioxide, which makes the bread rise, and alcohol. The bacteria eat the leftovers and excrete lactic acid and acetic acid. This acid is the secret weapon. It gives the bread its signature sour tongue, sure, but more importantly, it acts as a preservative. A loaf of commercial white bread will mold in a week. A dense, acidic loaf of medieval sourdough can last for weeks, or even months if dried properly. The acid is a chemical shield that mold spores hate. You aren't just baking. You are pickling the grain. You check the bowl the next day. It looks gray and lifeless. You feed it more flour and water. You check it the day after. Still nothing. You start to worry. If this fails, you are eating rocks this winter. But on the 4th day, you lift the cloth and a smell hits you. It isn't the smell of rot. It is the smell of life. It smells yeasty, fruity, sour, and sharp. It smells like beer. You look inside, and the surface of the paste is frothed with bubbles. It's alive. You have captured the levain. You have successfully domesticated a colony of fungi. This bubbling goo is now the most valuable pet you own. You will feed it every day. You will keep it warm. If the house catches fire, you will save the baby, and then you will save the starter. Because if the starter dies, the family stars. This brings us to a quirky fringe tidbit, the barm method. While catching wild yeast from the air works, it's risky. Sometimes you catch bad yeast that smells like vomit. So, medieval housewives often used a cheat code. They would go to the local brewer, or the brewing vat in their own shed, and skim the foamy scum off the top of the fermenting beer. This scum, called barm, was pure active yeast. It made bread rise faster and taste sweeter than the wild-caught stuff. It was the first instance of technology transfer between the bar and the bakery. You take a scoop of your bubbling starter, the mother, and mix it into a large trough of flour. You knead it. It is hard, physical labor. You are developing gluten, the elastic network that will trap the gas bubbles. You shape the loaves and let them rise. They don't puff up like Wonder Bread. They rise slowly, begrudgingly, expanding into dense, heavy rounds. You bake them in the communal oven or on the hearthstones. When they come out, they are dark, crusted with ash, and heavy as bricks. You tap the bottom. It sounds hollow. You slice one open. The crumb is tight and moist. You take a bite. It is chewy and deeply sour. It fights back against your jaw. But this bread has a superpower, because the fermentation process has pre-digested the gluten and neutralized the phytic acid, a compound in grain that blocks mineral absorption. This bread is infinitely more nutritious than unfermented bread. You are getting more iron, zinc, and magnesium from the same amount of grain. The microbes unlocked the nutrients for you. This leads to a fascinating scholarly debate, the beer versus bread hypothesis. Did humans settle down and invent agriculture 10,000 years ago because we wanted to make bread to feed our families? Or did we do it because we wanted to make beer to get drunk? Some archaeologists argue that the earliest cultivated grains were better suited for brewing than baking. They suggest that civilization is essentially a byproduct of the quest for a buzz. The bread might just be the solid version of the beer, a way to use up the leftover mash. You chew the sour crust, thinking about that. Bread is sustenance. It is the body of life, but it is dry work. All this salt curing, pickling, and flour dusting makes you incredibly thirsty. You look at the bucket of water in the corner. You know you shouldn't drink it. You know that the water from the river causes the flux, dysentery. Your neighbor drank from the stream last week. You wipe the crumbs of the sourdough crust from your lips, but the dryness remains. Your throat feels like it has been lined with the same wool that stuffs your mattress. The salt from the ham, the acidity of the pickles, and the density of the bread have combined to create a thirst that feels structural. You need liquid. You need it now. You look at the wooden bucket standing by the door. It is filled with water drawn from the nearby stream. The water looks clear. It sparkles in the shaft of sunlight coming through the window. To a modern eye, it looks refreshing. But you know better. You know that upstream, the tanner is soaking cow hides in that river. You know the shepherd washes his sheep in it. You know that cesspits leak into it. In the Middle Ages, surface water is not a beverage. It is a gamble. Drink that bucket, and you might spend the next week dying of the bloody flux, dysentery, or typhoid. So you turn your back on the water. You walk to the other barrel, the one that smells sweet, earthy, and yeasty. You dip your ladle into the ale. You are about to drink the Gatorade of the 13th century. A mainstream historical fact you should know is that for the average medieval person, ale wasn't a party drink. It was a hydration strategy. Men, women, and even children drank small beer, or weak ale, from the moment they woke up until they went to sleep. The typical allowance for a laborer or a monk was often a gallon a day. That's 8 pints. But before you picture a society of stumbling drunks, realize that this ale had a very low alcohol content, usually between 0.5% and 2.5%. It was enough to kill the bacteria, but not enough to get you hammered during the harvest. You take a sip. It is thick. It is cloudy with suspended yeast and grain particles. It tastes like liquid bread sweet, smoky, and slightly sour. It is room temperature and flat. If you served this in a modern pub, you'd be shut down. But to you, it tastes like safety. Why is it safe? Because of the process you used to make it. You start with the grain barley usually, but you can't just boil raw barley. You have to malt it. You soak the grain in water until it starts to sprout. This tricks the seed into releasing enzymes, amylase, that convert its stored starch into sugar. Then you roast it to stop the sprouting. You crush this malt and soak it in hot water. This creates a sugary, sticky liquid called wort. And here is the magic step. You boil the wort. You don't know about pasteurization. Louis Pasteur won't be born for centuries. But by boiling the wort to concentrate the sugars and extract flavors, you are accidentally sterilizing the liquid. You are killing the cholera and the E. coli. After boiling, you add your flavorings. For centuries, this was a mixture of herbs called groot, bog myrtle, yarrow, rosemary, mugs. But recently, a new plant has been arriving from the continent. A weed that climbs vines and smells pungent. Hops. This brings us to a fascinating scholarly debate, the hops revolution. Historians argue that the shift from ale, unhopped, flavored with groot, to beer, hopped, was the most significant event in food preservation history after salt. Why? Because hops aren't just for flavor. They contain alpha acids that are potent bacteriacids. They stop bacteria from growing. Unhopped ale would go sour in a week. Hopped beer could last for months. The introduction of hops allowed beer to be exported, stored, and saved for the hunger gap. It was the invention of the shelf-stable beverage. You, being a traditional peasant, might still be using a mix. You throw the herbs into the boiling wort. Then, you let it cool in a large shallow tub. Once it is cool, you add the goddesgoed, the yeast. As we discussed with the bread, this yeast eats the sugar and churns out alcohol and carbon dioxide. But you don't let it ferment forever. If you let it go too long, all the sugar turns to alcohol and you get strong ale. That's for feast days and weddings. That's for getting rowdy. For daily survival, you stop the fermentation early or use the second run of water through the grain to keep the sugar high and the alcohol low. You swallow the ale, feeling the calories hit your stomach. This drink provides you with carbohydrates, proteins from the leftover yeast, and B vitamins. It is a meal in a glass. But how do you know if you brewed it right? You don't have a hydrometer to measure the sugar or alcohol. You have your pants. This leads to a quirky fringe tidbit, the legend of the ale cunner. In medieval England, there were officials whose job was to test the quality of the ale. The story goes that an ale cunner would pour a puddle of ale onto a wooden bench and then sit in it while wearing leather breeches. He would sit there for 30 minutes. If, when he tried to stand up, his breeches stuck to the bench, the ale was deemed high quality, full of residual sugar. If he didn't stick, it was too watery or too fermented. You are essentially sitting in your own quality control department. You finish your ladle of small beer. You are hydrated, you are fed, and you are slightly buzzed, just enough to make the cold draft in the cottage feel less biting. But as you look around your larder, you realize something is missing. You have the carbs, red ale, the fiber, pickles, and the meat, ham. But you need fat. You need protein that doesn't require slaughtering a pig. You need the bounty of the summer sun, captured in a solid form. You look at the bucket of milk Bessie gave you this morning. Milk is the most perishable substance you own. In this weather, it will sour in 24 hours. In the summer, it sours in 4. You can't freeze it. You can't salt it. Well, you wouldn't want to drink salted milk. You have to transform it. You have to perform the ultimate act of biological alchemy. You are going to take this white, liquid, fleeting fluid and turn it into a yellow, hard, immortal rock. You are going to separate the water from the solid. You are going to the cheese cave, and this isn't the soft, spreadable brie of the modern world. You are making a wheel of cheese so hard that, in a pinch, you could possibly use it as a replacement wheel for your cart. You stare into the wooden bucket at the gallon of fresh milk Bessie gave you this morning. It is warm, frothy, and white. It smells of sweet cream and cow breath. It is the most perfect, complete food in nature, and it is doomed. If you leave this bucket here on the table, by tomorrow morning, it will have separated into a sour, clumpy mess. By the day after, it will be hosting a colony of pathogens that will turn your stomach inside out. Milk is the most perishable substance in your life because it is designed to be consumed immediately by a baby calf. It isn't designed to sit in a pantry, but you can't drink a gallon of milk in one sitting. And you certainly can't save it for the winter, unless ... you break it. You are about to perform the most violent act of preservation in your repertoire. You are going to destroy the milk to save it. You are going to separate the water, the enemy, from the solids, the prize. You are going to make cheese. But you don't want the soft, spreadable cream cheese of the modern bagel shop. That stuff expires in a week. You want a cheese that acts like a brick. You want a cheese that you can roll down a hill, stack in a corner like firewood, and eat 3 years from now when the harvest fails. To do this, you need a catalyst. You need something to curdle the milk instantly. You reach for a small, dried pouch hanging from the rafters. It looks like a piece of old leather. It is the stomach of an unweaned calf. This is rennet. A mainstream historical fact you should know is that before synthetic enzymes were invented in the 20th century, the only way to make cheese was to harvest the stomach lining of a young animal that had only ever drunk milk. This lining contains chymosin, an enzyme designed to coagulate milk in the stomach so digestion can happen. By slicing a piece of this dried stomach and soaking it in water, you extract the enzyme. You then pour that rennet water into your warm milk. You stir it in. You wait. Suddenly, the alchemy happens. The liquid milk solidifies into a gelatinous white mass. It looks like porcelain pudding. You take a long knife or a cheese harp, and you slash through the curd. Slice, slice. As you cut, the mass weeps yellow liquid. This is the way. You have successfully separated the solids, curds, from the water. Now comes the labor. You scoop the curds into a cloth and squeeze. You twist the cloth until your knuckles turn white. You are wringing the life out of the cheese. Every drop of whey that hits the floor is a victory against rot. You pack the dry, crumbly curds into a wooden mold and place a heavy stone on top. For the next few days, you will tighten the screws or add more stones, forcing the remaining moisture out under immense pressure. You are turning food into a geological stratum. Once the wheel is pressed, it is a rubbery white disc. But it isn't safe yet. It needs armor. You rub salt all over the rind, just like you did with the ham. The salt draws out moisture from the surface and creates a hard, inhospitable crust. Now you have to bury it. You carry the heavy wheel to the village cheese cave, or perhaps a dugout cellar under your cottage. It is dark, cool, and smells intensely of ammonia and wet earth. This is the aging room. You place your wheel on a wooden shelf next to dozens of others. Some are new and white. Others are yellow, orange, or brown. The oldest ones look like rocks. Here, in the dark, the second fermentation happens. The bacteria trapped inside the cheese, galactococci and lactobacilli, begin to break down the proteins and fats. They are pre-digesting the cheese for you, turning bland curds into sharp, complex flavor bombs. But you are not alone in the cave. This brings us to a quirky, fringe tidbit, the cheese mite cultivation. You notice a fine gray dust covering the older cheeses. You lean in closer. The dust is moving. It is millions of microscopic mites, Pteroglyphus cero. To a modern sanitation inspector, this is a catastrophe. To you, it's a feature. These mites eat the mold that grows on the rind, keeping the cheese clean. In some medieval cheeses, and even some traditional ones today, like mimolette, the mites are encouraged. They aerate the rind, allowing the cheese to breathe and develop a nutty flavor. You aren't just eating fermented milk. You are eating the byproduct of an insect farm. As the months pass, your cheese undergoes a physical transformation. It loses 20 to 30% of its weight as water evaporates. The texture changes from rubbery to crystalline. Calcium lactate crystals form inside the paste, giving it that delightful crunch you find in very old Parmesan. This cheese is now immortal. A wheel of hard cheese, properly kept, can last for years. It becomes so hard that you can't cut it with a knife. You have to chisel it. It was so durable that it was often used as currency. You could pay your rent in cheese. You could pay your tithe to the church in cheese. It was the Bitcoin of the dairy world, a store of value that you could eat. This leads to a fascinating scholarly debate, the raw milk paradox. Modern health regulations, like the FDA's, often ban raw milk cheese unless it is aged for at least 60 days. The fear is pathogens like Listeria and E. coli. Yet, medieval peasants drank raw milk and ate raw milk cheese exclusively. Why didn't they all die of food poisoning? Some historians and microbiologists argue that the biodiversity of medieval milk actually protected it. The sheer number of competitive, good bacteria in the milk outcompeted the pathogens. By sterilizing milk, pasteurization, we create a blank slate where superbugs can grow unchecked if reintroduced. By keeping it wild, the peasant kept it safe. You check on a wheel that has been aging for 2 years. It is dark brown. You tap it with your knuckle. Thunk. It sounds like wood. This is old whack, or starvation cheese. It is incredibly salty, incredibly sharp, and dense with calories. When the hunger gap hits in May, and the bread has run out, and the ham is just a bone, this cheese will save you. A piece the size of your thumb has enough fat and protein to keep you plowing for an afternoon. But there is a catch. Cheese is heavy. It sits in your stomach like a stone. And while it is savory, it lacks ... punch. It lacks that deep, meaty richness that makes food satisfying. You have salt, pork. You have sour, pickles. You have sweet, ale bread. You have fat, cheese. But you are missing the fifth taste. You are missing umami. You crave the taste of meat, but you can't afford to kill another pig. You need a flavor enhancer. You need something that turns a bowl of boiled turnips into a feast. You look toward the coast, or perhaps to the river traders coming inland. They bring barrels of a dark, foul-smelling liquid that dates back to the Roman Empire. It is the ketchup of the ancient world, but it isn't made of tomatoes. It is made of death. You are about to explore the world of garum and fish sauces. You are about to take the guts of a fish, the parts you would normally throw away, and ferment them until they dissolve into a liquid gold that tastes like savory heaven. It smells like a harbor at low tide, but to your medieval palate, it is the taste of luxury. You are standing in the market square, and you smell it before you see it. It is a pungent, aggressive odor mix of low tide, old socks, and salty ocean air. It is coming from a barrel on the back of a merchant's cart. To a modern nose, this smell is offensive. To you, it is the smell of flavor. You are about to buy a jug of fish sauce. In the modern world, we associate fish sauce with Thai curries or Vietnamese pho. But in the Middle Ages, and going back to ancient Rome, fermented fish sauce was the ketchup of Europe. The Romans called it garum or liquamen. By the Middle Ages, the specific Roman recipe had faded in some places, but the concept survived in various forms, like salted herrings or the liquid runoff from barreled fish. You hand over a few copper coins and receive a small clay pot of dark amber liquid. You take a sniff. It makes your eyes water. But you know that a single drop of this stuff can transform a pot of bland, boiled grain into something that tastes like roast meat. How is it made? It is the ultimate act of waste not, want not. You take the parts of the fish you can't eat, the intestines, the gills, the heads, the blood. You throw them into a vat. You cover them with salt, lots of salt, usually a 1:5 ratio. And then ... you leave it in the sun for months. This is enzymatic hydrolysis. Unlike the sauerkraut or the cheese, which rely on bacteria to do the work, fish sauce relies on the enzymes already present in the fish's own guts. Specifically, the proteases, enzymes that break down protein in the fish stomachs, start to digest the fish from the inside out. The salt prevents the fish from rotting, bacterial putrefaction, but it allows the enzymes to liquefy the solid meat. Over the course of a few months, the fish disappears. It turns into a sludge and then separates into a clear golden liquid. This liquid is pure amino acids. It is concentrated glutamate. It is liquid MSG. A mainstream historical fact you should know is that MSG, monosodium glutamate, wasn't invented in a lab in 1908. Humans have been chemically engineering it for thousands of years through fermentation. When proteins break down, they release glutamate, which triggers the umami receptors on your tongue. That savory, mouth-watering sensation you get from a steak or a piece of Parmesan? That's glutamate. Your fish sauce is a glutamate bomb. You take your pot home. Tonight, you are eating potage's stew of cabbage and oats. It is boring. It tastes like wet socks. But you add a splash of the fish sauce. Suddenly, the pottage tastes rich, deep, and satisfying. You have hacked your taste buds. This leads to a fascinating scholarly debate, the Roman decline theory. Some historians have argued that the fall of the Roman Empire coincided with the decline of the garum trade. The theory goes that the salt tax and the collapse of long-distance trade routes made fish sauce too expensive to produce and transport. Without this cheap source of protein and salt, the nutritional quality of the peasant diet collapsed, contributing to the Dark Ages. It's a stretch, but it highlights how vital this sauce was. It wasn't just a condiment. It was a nutrient delivery system. But there is a risk. If you don't use enough salt, the fish doesn't ferment. It rots. You get Clostridium botulinum. You get a barrel of poison. This brings us to a quirky fringe tidbit, the botulism etymology. The word botulism comes from the Latin botulus, meaning sausage. Why? Because early cases of the disease were often linked to poorly fermented blood sausages. But fish sauce was a frequent culprit too. If you skimped on the salt to save money, you are brewing death. The smell of good funk and bad funk is a subtle distinction that you, the peasant, have to learn by heart. You cork the jug tight. This liquid will last forever. It is so salty that no bacteria can live in it. It is shelf-stable protein. But looking at your dinner of pottage and fish sauce, you realize something is still missing. You have the savory, you have the salty, you have the starch. But you feel heavy. Your gums are a little sore. Your joints ache in the damp weather. You are lacking freshness. You are lacking the crunch of something green. But the garden is dead. The snow is falling. There are no fresh salads in January. You need a vegetable that can fight the winter. You need a vegetable that fights the scurvy ghost. You look at the pile of white cabbages in the corner. They are tough, fibrous, and sulfurous. On their own, they are uninspiring. But if you stomp on them, if you beat them into submission and bury them in salt ... they transform. They become the superfood of the North. You are about to make the dish that built empires, fueled armies, and prevented millions of sailors from losing their teeth. You are about to enter the sauerkraut silo. You look at the pile of cabbages stacked against the wall. They are the size of human heads, pale green and dense as cannonballs. In the dead of winter, when the ground is frozen hard as iron and the apple trees are bare skeletons, these cabbages are the only green things left on Earth. But you can't just eat them raw. If you gnaw on a raw winter cabbage, you will spend the next 3 days doubled over with cramps, producing enough gas to float a dirigible. The cellulose is too tough. The sulfur compounds are too aggressive. You need to break it down. You need to pre-digest it. You grab a sharp knife and a wooden board. You begin to shred the cabbage into thin ribbons. It is monotonous work. The smell of raw brassica fills the room, a sharp, mustardy tongue that stings the nose. You sweep the shredded cabbage into a massive wooden tub. And then you take off your boots. You take off your socks, if you're wearing any. You wash your feet, hopefully. And you climb in. You are about to become a human pestle. You start to stomp, squish, crunch, squish. This isn't just for fun. You are performing mechanical lysis. You are crushing the cell walls of the cabbage leaves to force them to release their liquid. You sprinkle handfuls of salt as you stomp. The salt draws the water out, mingling with the plant juices to create a natural brine. You do not add water. This is the golden rule of the sauerkraut silo. Make the vegetable cry its own tears. If you add water, you dilute the sugars and the acid, risking rot. You want pure, undiluted cabbage blood. After an hour of stomping, your legs are tired and your feet are freezing. But the cabbage is submerged in a pool of foamy, greenish liquid. You pack it tight into a barrel, place a heavy wooden lid on top, and weigh it down with a rock. A mainstream historical fact you should know is that sauerkraut and its cousin kimchi was the primary defense against scurvy for centuries, long before anyone knew what a vitamin was. Scurvy is a horrific disease where your old scars open up, your gums rot, and your teeth fall out. It is caused by a lack of vitamin C. Fresh cabbage has some vitamin C, but here is the miracle. Fermentation actually increases it. The bacterial action synthesizes new nutrients and makes the existing ones more bioavailable. A bowl of sauerkraut in February contains more usable vitamin C than the fresh cabbage did in October. You are stomping your way to a multivitamin. You push the barrel into the corner. Over the next few weeks, the Leuconostoc mesenteroids bacteria will wake up and start producing carbon dioxide and lactic acid. The barrel will hiss. It will bubble. It might even overflow with frothy scum. This is good. This is the sound of safety. This brings us to a fascinating scholarly debate, the Mongol saddlebag theory. Where did sauerkraut come from? The Germans lay claim to the name, but historians argue that the technique originated in China during the construction of the Great Wall. The workers lived on fermented cabbage and rice wine. The theory goes that the Golden Horde, the armies of Genghis Khan, brought the recipe west in their saddlebags. The Tartars used it to survive the long steppes, and when they invaded Europe, they left the recipe behind. So your German kraut might actually be a Chinese import delivered by Mongol cavalry. But there is a downside to the kraut silo: the smell. As the fermentation hits its peak, the sulfur compounds in the cabbage break down into hydrogen sulfide. Your cottage begins to smell distinctively like ... flatulence. It smells like rotten eggs and old socks. This leads to a quirky fringe tidbit, the kraut etiquette. In some medieval monastic orders, monks were forbidden from eating beans or cabbage on certain feast days because the resulting digestion issues were considered disruptive to prayer. The musical fruit wasn't just a playground rhyme. It was a theological concern. A choir of monks chanting Gregorian chants while digesting a barrel of sauerkraut was a risk to the sanctity of the service. But you don't care about the smell. You care about the crunch. You open the barrel in January. You pull out a handful of the translucent yellow threads. You take a bite. It is intensely sour, salty, and shockingly crunchy. It wakes up your mouth. It cuts through the grease of the pork you served it with. It settles your stomach. You feel the acid burn a little on your chapped lips, but you smile. You know that as long as you have the kraut, your teeth will stay in your head. But man cannot live on sour cabbage alone. You have the salt pork, you have the cheese, you have the bread, and you have the pickles. But you crave something else. You crave a flavor that reminds you of the hearth. You want meat that doesn't just taste like salt. You want meat that tastes like fire. You look at the strips of venison or beef hanging from the rafters. You could salt them, yes, but you want to do something more sophisticated. You want to coat them in a layer of chemical armor derived from the soul of the forest. You want to turn wood into food preservative. You walk to the smokehouse. It is a small, dark shed that looks like it is on fire. Smoke pours from the eaves. You cough as you open the door. You are about to enter the chamber of creosote, where you will trade oxygen for carcinogens in the name of survival. You step into the smokehouse, and instantly your eyes begin to sting. The air is thick, blue, and heavy, swirling with the ghosts of burning oak and juniper. You cough, pulling your scarf up over your nose, but the smell penetrates everything. It clings to your hair, your clothes, and your skin. To a modern person, this smells like a barbecue restaurant. To you, it smells like survival. You reach up and hang a strip of venison on a wooden rack, right next to a row of sausages that look like dry, shriveled fingers. You are not cooking this meat. You are fumigating it. In the modern world, we think of smoking as a flavor profile. We buy hickory-smoked bacon or mesquite chips because we like the taste. But in the Middle Ages, flavor was just a happy accident. The real goal was chemical warfare. You are coating your food in creosote. A mainstream historical fact you should know is that wood smoke is essentially a cocktail of antimicrobial chemicals. When you burn hardwood slowly, smoldering, not flaming, it releases phenols, formaldehyde, and acetic acid in vapor form. These compounds float up in the smoke and land on the surface of the meat. As the smoke washes over the hanging venison, the phenols bind to the proteins on the surface. They do two things. They kill any bacteria currently sitting there, and they act as an antioxidant, preventing the fat from going rancid. Rancid fat is the enemy of long-term storage. It tastes like paint thinner and makes you sick. The smoke stops that oxidation dead in its tracks. But there is a physical change too. You watch as the meat begins to darken. It develops a shiny, tacky skin known as the pellicle. The pellicle is a protective shell. It is dehydrated, hardened protein that acts like a biological shrink wrap. Flies can't lay eggs through it. Bacteria can't burrow through it. You are sealing the nutrients inside a casing of edible varnish. But you have to be careful about the wood. You don't just throw any old branch on the fire. If you use pine or fir, softwoods, the meat will taste like turpentine and be covered in a bitter black soot. You need hardwoods: oak, beech, apple, or hickory. This brings us to a fascinating scholarly debate: the carcinogen trade-off. Biogeologists and medical historians have noted a grim correlation in populations that relied heavily on smoked foods, like medieval Northern Europeans, or later, Icelanders. They had incredibly high rates of stomach and esophageal cancer. The same chemicals that kill the bacteria, formaldehyde and polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, also damage human DNA. The peasant faced a brutal choice: eat fresh food and risk dying of botulism or starvation next week, or eat smoked food and risk dying of cancer in 30 years. Given that life expectancy was already low, they chose the cancer. They chose to survive the winter. You wipe your tearing eyes. You are practicing cold smoking. The temperature in here is barely warm, maybe 80 degrees Fahrenheit, 26 degrees Celsius. You aren't cooking the meat. If you cooked it, the fat would render out, and the meat would spoil faster. You want it raw but preserved. You will leave these sausages hanging here for weeks, sometimes months. When you take them down, they will be hard as wood. To eat them, you will have to soak them in water or boil them in pottage to rehydrate them. It's not a tender steak. It's a meat stick, but it is safe. This leads to a quirky fringe tidbit: the chimney bacon economy. In many medieval cottages, there was no separate smokehouse. The smokehouse was just the chimney of the main living room. Peasants would hang their sides of bacon directly inside the chimney flue. This meant that every time you lit a fire to warm your feet, you were preserving your dinner. It also meant that if your chimney caught fire, a common occurrence due to the buildup of soot and grease dripping from the bacon, your entire house and your food supply burned down in minutes. It gave a literal meaning to burning your bacon. You checked the fire. It is a pile of glowing embers buried under damp sawdust. You need it to smolder, not flare. You adjust the airflow. It is a delicate balance. Too much air, and you cook the meat. Too little air, and the fire goes out. You are a stoker of the preservation engine. You step back out into the cool, fresh air. The contrast is shocking. Your lungs crave the oxygen. You look at your hands. They are stained brown from the smoke and the handling of the meat. You smell like a bonfire. You have secured the protein. The ham is salted. The sausages are smoked. The cabbage is bubbling in the crock. The ale is brewing. You have covered the savory, the salty, and the sour. But the human spirit cannot live on salt alone. You crave sweetness. You crave the taste of summer fruit: strawberries, cherries, apples. But fruit is the most fragile thing in the garden. It rots in days. It molds in hours. You can't salt a strawberry. Well, you shouldn't. You can't smoke a peach. So, how do you save the soul of a fruit? You have to bury it in the only substance in nature that never spoils. You have to use the golden liquid that was found in the tombs of Egyptian pharaohs, perfectly edible after 3,000 years. You are going to use sugar, but not the white powder from the future. You are going to use the vomit of 1,000 insects. You are going to the beehive. You are about to enter the honeydew. You stand in the garden near the sheltered wall where the skeps, coiled straw baskets that house your bees, are humming with the last lethargic activity of the year. You are holding a basket of late-season pears, or perhaps a handful of precious wild berries gathered from the hedgerow. These are the jewels of the harvest. They are sweet, fragile, and absolutely doomed. If you leave a pear on the table, it rots from the inside out in days. The brown spots appear like bruises, the flesh turns mealy, and the fruit flies descend. You can't salt a pear. You'd get a salty, inedible mush. You can't smoke it. It would taste like a bonfire. You could dry it, but dried fruit is chewy and tough leather made of fructose. You want to preserve the freshness. You want to bite into a pear in January and taste the sunshine of September. To do that, you need to bury it in the only substance on earth that is naturally eternal. You are going to use honey. You take a ceramic jar and place the clean, dry fruit inside. Then you pour the thick, golden liquid over it. It moves slowly, like molten amber, filling every gap, coating every skin, pushing out every pocket of air. You watch as the fruit disappears beneath the surface. You seal the lid with wax. You have just built a honey tomb. A mainstream historical fact you should know is that honey is the only food that essentially never spoils. Archaeologists have found pots of honey in ancient Egyptian tombs buried with pharaohs over 3,000 years ago that were still perfectly edible. They crystallized, sure, but once warmed up, they were as good as the day the bees made them. Why? Because honey is a biological desert. It works on the same principle as the salt, but sweeter. Honey is supersaturated with sugar, about 80%, and has incredibly low water content, about 17%. In scientific terms, it has extremely low water activity, aw. Bacteria need water to survive. When a bacterium lands in honey, the sugar draws the water out of the bacterium's body through osmosis, causing it to implode. Furthermore, honey contains trace amounts of hydrogen peroxide, produced by an enzyme in the bee's stomach. It is naturally antiseptic. By submerging your pears in honey, you are placing them in a sterile, dehydrated stasis field. In the depths of winter, when you open that jar, the fruit will be somewhat shriveled. The honey pulls water out of the fruit too, but it will be intensely sweet and preserved. The honey itself will have taken on the flavor of the fruit. It is a dual victory. But this brings us to a tense scholarly debate, the peasant sweetener reality. We often picture medieval peasants enjoying mead and honey cakes. But historians argue that for the average serf, honey was a luxury item, not a staple. A hive might only produce a few pounds of honey a year. The lord of the manor often claimed the wax rights for candles and a portion of the honey. Did peasants really preserve whole jars of fruit in pure honey? Probably not often. It was likely reserved for medicine or the high table. You, the savvy survivor, might only have one small jar of honey preserves hidden away for a sick child. Speaking of medicine, honey's preservation power leads to one of the most disturbing and quirky fringe tidbits in history, the mellified man. According to Chinese medical texts, specifically the Benkao Gang Mu, and referenced in some medieval travelers' tales, there was a legendary medicine made by mummifying a human in honey. The story goes that an elderly volunteer near death would stop eating food and eat only honey. They would bathe in honey. Eventually, they would die, sugar overdose or starvation, and their body would be placed in a stone coffin filled with honey. After a century, the body would dissolve into the honey, creating a confection believed to heal broken bones. While there is no physical evidence this actually happened, the very existence of the legend proves that people understood honey's power to preserve organic flesh indefinitely. You are doing the same thing, just with a pear instead of grandpa. You lick the sticky residue from your thumb. It is shockingly sweet a flavor explosion in a diet dominated by bland grains and salty meats. This sugar rush is rare for you. It hits your brain like a drug, but honey has a limit. It is expensive, sticky, And you can't preserve a whole pig in it, unless you're making mellified pork, which sounds terrible. You still have cuts of meat that are too small to smoke, and too odd to salt scraps of duck, goose legs, or chunks of pork belly. You want to preserve them in a way that makes them tender, not tough. You want them to melt in your mouth, not break your teeth. You look at the render pot near the fire. It is filled with white, creamy lard, pig fat, or tallow, beef fat. You realize that if bacteria need water and oxygen to survive, then maybe the answer isn't to dry the food out, but to seal it in something that repels water entirely. You are about to cook the meat in its own fat, and then bury it in that same fat. You are about to invent the gourmet delicacy of the French bistro, but for you, it isn't fine dining. It is a grease seal against death. You are preparing confit. You turn from the sticky sweetness of the honey jar to the savory, sputtering warmth of the hearth. You have preserved the large cuts of meat with salt and smoke, and the vegetables with brine. But you still have a problem. You have the offcuts. You have the legs of a goose that stopped laying. You have the belly of the pig that was too fatty to dry cure. You have chunks of rabbit snared in the field. These pieces are irregular, fatty, and awkward. If you try to hang them in the smokehouse, they might drip grease on the fire and burn the place down. If you salt them, the fat prevents the salt from penetrating deep enough, risking rot at the center. You need a method that loves fat. You need a technique that uses the animal's own grease as a sarcophagus. You grab a heavy iron cauldron. You chop the meat into chunks, salting them lightly first to draw out some moisture. Then you throw them into the pot, but you don't add water. You add fat. You scoop generous ladlefuls of white, creamy lard, rendered pig fat, or golden goose fat into the pot. You place it over a low fire. You don't want it to boil violently. You want it to shudder. You want a gentle, lazy simmer. This is the art of confit. In modern French cuisine, duck confit is a luxury dish sold for $40 a plate. It's prized for its texture meat that falls off the bone and skin that crisps like glass. But for you, the peasant, texture is a side effect. The goal is storage. As the meat poaches in the hot fat for hours, two things happen. First, the heat kills the bacteria. Second, And more importantly, the water inside the meat cells evaporates and is replaced by oil. You are swapping the lifeblood of bacteria, water, for a substance they cannot swim in, fat. Once the meat is tender, you fish it out and pack it into a glazed stoneware crock. You pack it tight. Then, you pour the hot, liquid fat over the top. You fill every gap. You cover the meat completely. You set the crock aside to cool. As the temperature drops, the fat solidifies. It turns from a golden liquid into a hard, white, opaque plug. You have created a hermetic seal. You have blocked the oxygen. A mainstream historical fact you should know is that the word confit comes from the French verb confire, meaning to preserve. It was strictly a survival technique for centuries before it became a culinary one. A crock of confit, kept in a cool cellar with the fat cap unbroken, could last for several months. When you got hungry, you would dig through the hard fat, pull out a preserved leg, and fry it. The fat protected the meat from oxidation, rancidity, and airborne mold. But this method wasn't just for whole legs. It was also for the scraps. You take the smaller bits of meat, the organs, and the gristly ends. You boil them in fat until they fall apart. You mash them into a paste with spices, pepper, mace, nutmeg, if you can afford them. You pack this paste into a small pot and seal it with clarified butter or lard. This is potting. You have essentially invented the great-grandfather of Spam. Potted meat was the medieval and Victorian solution to leftover protein. It was a staple of the pantry, a dense, spreadable meat butter that wouldn't spoil. This brings us to a quirky fringe tidbit, the potted hustle. Because the meat was ground up and sealed under fat, you couldn't see what was inside. Unscrupulous butchers and cooks realized this was the perfect way to get rid of meat that was ... questionable. If a piece of beef was starting to smell a bit funky, they would boil it, drown it in heavy spices to mask the rot, and pot it. Potted meat became notorious in later centuries as a mystery gamble. Was it beef? Was it horse? Was it slightly green before they added the nutmeg? You swallow hard and hope you seasoned it well enough. However, there is a deadly shadow hanging over your fat-sealed crock. This leads to a tense scholarly debate, the anaerobic risk. You have created an oxygen-free environment under the fat that is not acidic, unlike the pickles. This is the exact playground preferred by Clostridium botulinum. The spores of this bacteria live in the soil and on raw meat. If you didn't heat the fat high enough to kill the spores, which requires temperatures above boiling, usually 240 degrees Fahrenheit, 116 degrees Celsius, and the salt level is too low, the spores can wake up inside the confit. They will produce the deadliest neurotoxin known to man. Historians and microbiologists argue about how often this happened. Some say the salt cure applied before cooking was usually enough to stop the spores. Others suggest that many cases of fatal indigestion or stroke in history were actually botulism from a bad pot of confit. You are essentially playing Russian roulette with a goose leg. But to you, the risk is invisible. You see a solid white jar. It looks clean. It smells like savory fat. It is calories in the bank. You place the crock on the shelf next to the cheese and the pickles. Your larder is now a fortress of preservation. You have dehydrated, brined, fermented, smoked, sugared, and potted your way to security. You have mastered the biological elements. You survive the winter. You eat the ham in December, the kraut in January, the cheese in February, and the confit in March. You make it to the spring. But fast forward a few centuries. The world is changing. The scientific revolution arrives. People stop trusting tradition and start trusting chemistry. Armies are getting bigger, and they need to march further. The old methods, the heavy barrels of salted pork, the fragile crocks of fat, are too clumsy for the modern soldier. A short man with a hand inside his coat is about to offer a reward. Napoleon Bonaparte needs to feed his army as they march across Europe. He doesn't want salty, hard meat. He wants fresh stew in Russia. You are about to witness the death of the living pantry and the birth of the dead pantry. You are about to trade your bacteria for heat. You are about to see the invention of the can. And it starts not with metal, but with glass and champagne corks. You step out of the dark, smoky cottage and blink. The scene dissolves. The mud and thatch are replaced by the cobblestones of Vanves, Paris. The year is 1795. The air is filled with the smell of gunpowder and revolution. You are no longer a medieval peasant worrying about the hunger gap for your family. You are a citizen of a republic that is at war with everyone. The armies of France are marching across Europe. But an army, as Napoleon Bonaparte will famously say, marches on its stomach. And right now, that stomach is growling. The salted pork is too salty to eat on the march without gallons of water. The hardtack biscuits are breaking soldiers' teeth. The livestock can't keep up with the troops. Soldiers are dying of scurvy and malnutrition before they even see a battlefield. The French government issues a challenge. A reward of 12,000 francs, a fortune, to anyone who can invent a new way to preserve food. They don't want dried, smoked, or salted. They want fresh food that can be carried in a knapsack to Russia. You enter the workshop of a man named Nicholas Appert. He is a confectioner, a maker of sweets. He is surrounded by bubbling cauldrons, not of witch's brew, but of soup, vegetables, and fruit. He is about to change the history of eating forever. You watch him work. He isn't using salt. He isn't using smoke. He isn't using fermentation bacteria. He is using something that the medieval peasant used only for cooking, not preserving: heat. Appert takes a thick glass bottle, essentially a heavy-duty champagne bottle. He stuffs it with green peas. He pours in a little water. Then he jams a cork into the neck, tighter than any wine cork. He uses a vise to squeeze it in. He wraps wire around the cork to hold it down, just like a muzzle on a dog. Then he wraps the bottle in canvas to stop it from clinking and shattering, and lowers it into a bath of boiling water. He boils it for hours, 5 hours, 6 hours. He doesn't know why he's doing this. He doesn't know what bacteria are. Louis Pasteur won't be born for another 27 years. Appert subscribes to the prevailing scientific theory of the time: spontaneous generation. He believes that contact with air causes food to rot. By driving the air out with heat and sealing the bottle, he thinks he is preventing the vital force of decay from entering. He is wrong about the science, but he is right about the result. A mainstream historical fact you should know is that Nicholas Appert is the father of canning, but he never used a metal can. He used glass. In 1810, after 15 years of experimentation, he presented his bottles to the government. They opened a bottle of sheep stew that had been sealed for months. It tasted ... fresh. It wasn't salty. It wasn't sour. It tasted like stew. He won the prize. He had achieved the impossible. He had suspended time without altering the flavor. You pick up one of these bottles. It is heavy. It is fragile. If you drop it, you lose your dinner. But inside, the peas are green. They are dead sterile, and perfectly preserved. This marks a philosophical shift in human history. For 10,000 years, preservation meant cultivating life, fermentation. You invited the good bacteria in to fight the bad ones. Your food was alive. Now, preservation means killing everything. Appertization, as it was called, is the art of sterilization. You are creating a biological void. You are nooking the food until nothing good or bad survives. This brings us to a fascinating scholarly debate: the theory versus practice lag. Historians often marvel that Appert perfected this technique half a century before anyone understood how it worked. He was operating purely on empirical evidence. If I boil it for 4 hours, it stays good. If I boil it for 2, it rots. It begs the question, how many other technologies are we currently using that work perfectly, even though our scientific explanation for them is completely wrong? We are standing on the shoulders of lucky guessers. But glass bottles are problematic for an army. They break. They are heavy. Across the channel, the British are watching. They see Appert's invention and think, good idea, bad container. In 1810, a merchant named Peter Durand patents the use of a tin-plated iron canister. The tin can is born. It is lighter than glass. It is unbreakable. You can throw it in a wagon, kick it down a hill, or use it as a weapon. The British Navy orders thousands of pounds of canned beef and soup. But there is a catch. A massive, ironic catch. You are holding a solid iron can from 1813. It is thick heavier than a modern soup can. It weighs a pound even when empty. It is soldered shut with lead. We'll get to that later. You are hungry. You want the beef inside, but you can't get in. This leads to a quirky fringe tidbit. The can opener gap. The tin can was invented in 1810. The can opener wasn't invented until 1855. Is a 45-year gap where humanity had indestructible food containers, but no dedicated tool to open them. Soldiers used bayonets. Sailors used hammers and chisels. Some cans even had instructions printed on them. Cut round the top near the outer edge with a chisel and hammer. You literally had to break into your own lunch, like a bank robber cracking a safe. You watch a soldier hacking at a can of roasted veal. He punctures the lid. A hiss of air escapes. He pries it open. Inside, the meat is gray and soft, but it is edible. This is the birth of the expiration date mentality. With the sauerkraut barrel, you knew it was good because it smelled active and sour. If it got too sour, you made soup. It was a gradient. With the can, it is binary. It is either perfectly preserved or the seal has failed, and it is a toxic biological weapon. There is no middle ground. You have traded the spectrum of fermentation for the safe, unsafe switch of sterilization. But as the 19th century rolls on, and canning factories spring up to feed the Industrial Revolution, a new horror begins to emerge. Sometimes the cans swell. The ends bulge out like a balloon. The workers call them blown cans. They toss them aside. But sometimes a can doesn't swell. It looks normal. It smells ... mostly okay. A family opens it. They eat the string beans inside, and 24 hours later, their vision goes blurry. Their eyelids droop. They can't swallow. Their diaphragm paralyzes. They suffocate while fully conscious. You have defeated the aerobic bacteria, the ones that need air, by sealing the can. You have defeated the mold. But you have inadvertently built the perfect luxury condo for the deadliest bacteria on Earth. A bacteria that hates air. A bacteria that has been waiting in the soil for millions of years for someone to invent a vacuum-sealed, low-acid, room-temperature container. You have built a home for botulinum. And unlike the medieval peasant who feared the bad air, you have no idea it's there. You think the can is safe because it is modern. You are about to learn that technology doesn't eliminate danger. It just changes the delivery mechanism. You are holding a tin of string beans from the mid-19th century. It looks innocuous. The label is cheerful. The metal is shiny. Unlike the bubbling, stinking sauerkraut barrel or the moldy cheese wheel, this container looks clean. It promises modern hygiene. But you are holding a grenade. You open it. There is no hiss of escaping gas. The beans don't smell like rotten eggs. They smell a little flat, maybe a little metallic, but otherwise fine. You heat them up and eat them for dinner. They taste okay soft, mushy, bland. 12 hours later, you try to read the morning newspaper, but the letters are swimming. You rub your eyes, thinking you're tired. You try to speak to your wife, but your tongue feels like a thick piece of velvet in your mouth. You slur your words. You try to stand up, but your knees buckle. You are suffering from the most lethal biological poisoning known to man. You have been struck by botulism. A mainstream historical fact you should know is that Clostridium botulinum is an anaerobic bacterium. This means it hates oxygen. In the open air, on a fresh apple or a hanging side of pork, it exists as a dormant spore, encased in a hard shell, completely harmless. You eat these spores on fresh vegetables all the time. They pass right through you. But the canning process created the one environment these spores had been waiting millions of years for. A nutrient-rich, wet, room temperature, and oxygen-free vacuum. Here is the fatal flaw of early canning. Water boils at 212 degrees Fahrenheit, 100 degrees Celsius. Nicholas Appert and the early industrial canners thought boiling water was the ultimate sterilizer. It kills active bacteria, yes, but botulism spores are like armored tanks. They can survive boiling water for hours. To kill the spore, you need to reach 240 degrees Fahrenheit, 116 degrees Celsius. You can't get water that hot unless you put it under pressure. So, when the canner boiled those beans, he killed the competition. He killed the mold, the yeast, and the lactobacillus. He cleared the field. The botulism spore woke up in a paradise with no enemies, plenty of food, and zero oxygen. It began to multiply and excrete a neurotoxin. This toxin blocks the release of acetylcholine, the chemical that tells your muscles to contract. It causes a descending flaccid paralysis. First your eyes go, then your throat, then your diaphragm. You don't lose consciousness. You lie there, fully awake, unable to move or breathe as you slowly suffocate in your own body. This brings us to a fascinating scholarly debate, the Franklin Expedition mystery. In 1845, Sir John Franklin led 2 ships into the Arctic to find the Northwest Passage. Everyone died. For decades, historians blamed lead poisoning from the solder used to seal the thousands of tins of soup and beef they carried. But modern analysis suggests it was likely a combination of lead and botulism. The food wasn't just toxic metal. It was a biological minefield. The canning technology was so new and unregulated that they were essentially eating Russian roulette rations. Comparing this to your medieval self, the irony is staggering. The medieval peasant lived in filth. He ate food that was literally rotting, fermenting. Yet, botulism was rare in the sauerkraut barrel. Why? Acidity. Remember the pickles and the kraut? Their pH was below 4.6. Botulism spores cannot wake up in acid. They remain dormant. Remember the ham? Salt. High salinity keeps the spores asleep. Remember the honey? Sugar, low water. The spores can't function. The medieval preservation methods were accidental hurdle technologies that specifically targeted the weaknesses of botulinum. The modern can remove the salt for flavor, remove the acid because people wanted fresh-tasting vegetables, and remove the oxygen. By trying to make the food purer, the Victorians made it deadlier. This leads to a quirky fringe tidbit, the ptomaine panic. Before 1897, when the bacterium was finally isolated by Emil van Ermingem after a funeral ham killed 3 musicians, doctors didn't know what botulism was. They diagnosed it as ptomaine poisoning. They believed that decomposing proteins spontaneously generated alkaloids called ptomaines. It was a catch-all diagnosis for, you ate something bad. People were terrified of bad air in cans, not realizing the killer was a specific heat-resistant bug. The solution, eventually, was the pressure retort, an industrial pressure cooker. By the 1920s, the canning industry figured out that they had to cook low-acid foods, beans, corn, meat, under massive pressure to break the 240 degrees Fahrenheit threshold. High-acid foods, tomatoes, fruits, were safe to just boil because the acid did the work. But the damage to our psyche was done. We learned to fear the bulging can. We learned that preserved food could be silent death. And so, we doubled down on sterility. We demanded that our food be nuked, irradiated, and pasteurized within an inch of its life. We wanted zero bacteria. You look at the can of beans again. It represents the triumph of science over nature. It is safe, now. It is convenient. But it is dead. And this leads to the final tragedy of our journey. In our quest to kill the botulism, we decided to kill everything. We declared war on the microbial world. We stopped eating living food and started eating sterile biomass. You put down the can and pick up a modern, plastic-wrapped slice of American cheese. It will last forever in the fridge. It will never mold. It will never ferment. It is a monument to preservation. But your gut, the trillions of bacteria living inside you, is starving. You have cut off the supply line of fresh recruits. You are about to realize that while the medieval peasant fought to keep his food alive, you are fighting to keep your own internal ecosystem from dying. You stand in the aisle of a modern supermarket. The fluorescent lights hum overhead, casting a harsh, clinical glare on the shelves. It is cold here, not the damp, earthy cold of the root cellar, but the dry, conditioned chill of industrial refrigeration. You look at the food. It is perfect. The apples are waxed and identical. The bread is soft and wrapped in plastic. The milk is pasteurized, homogenized, and vitamin fortified. The jars of pickles are clear, containing cucumbers suspended in sterile vinegar that has never seen a bacteria in its life. You are standing in a cathedral of sterility. For the first time in human history, the vast majority of the food you eat is dead. Not just harvested dead, but microbiologically dead. It has been oiled, radiated, bleached, and chemically stabilized to ensure that nothing, absolutely nothing, lives inside it. You pick up a yogurt. The label proudly screams, contains live active cultures. It's a selling point. You pay extra for it. This is the ultimate irony. To your medieval ancestor, everything had live active cultures. The beer had yeast. The cheese had mites and mold. The sauerkraut was a riot of lactobacillus. The ham was teeming with beneficial halophiles. He didn't take a probiotic pill. He ate a probiotic lifestyle. A mainstream historical fact you should know is that the average pre-industrial human consumed millions of times more bacteria every day than you do. This wasn't because they were dirty, though they were, but because their preservation methods relied on bacterial colonization. You, by contrast, live in a bacteriophobic culture. We have spent the last 100 years waging a chemical war on germs with antibiotics, chlorine, and preservatives like sodium benzoate. We won the war, but we are now realizing we might have killed the civilians too. You walk to the pharmacy section. You see shelves lined with anti-allergy medication, anti-inflammatory drugs, and digestive aids. This leads to a fierce scholarly debate. The hygiene hypothesis, or the old friends hypothesis. Why do modern humans suffer from so many allergies, autoimmune diseases, and chronic inflammatory conditions that were virtually unknown in the Middle Ages? The theory suggests that our immune systems evolved over millions of years to constantly fight and negotiate with a heavy load of bacteria and parasites. We co-evolved with them. These old friends taught our immune system the difference between a dangerous pathogen, kill it, and harmless pollen or peanut dust, ignore it. When we sterilized our world, we fired the trainers. Your immune system is now like a bored security guard with no one to fight. So it starts attacking innocent bystanders. It attacks gluten. It attacks cat dander. It attacks your own gut lining, Crohn's disease. The medieval peasant had worms, yes, but he probably didn't have a peanut allergy. His immune system was too busy keeping him alive to worry about a legume. You look at a bottle of bleach. It promises to kill 99.9% of germs. But in the medieval cellar, the goal wasn't 99.9% death. It was competitive exclusion. The peasant knew, intuitively, that you can't have a vacuum. If you clear a field of all plants, weeds will grow. If you sterilize your gut or your food, the first thing to grow back is often the opportunist, the weed. Clostridium difficile, C. diff, is a perfect example of a modern hospital superbug that thrives only when antibiotics have wiped out the competition. The cheese cave and the pickle crock were ecosystems where the good guys were so numerous that the bad guys could unfind a parking spot. This brings us to a quirky fringe tidbit, the poop pill of the 4th century. We think fecal microbiota transplants, FNT, are a cutting-edge modern therapy for restoring gut health. But Che Hong, a Chinese doctor in the 4th century, prescribed yellow soup, a suspension of fecal matter from a healthy person, to treat patients with severe food poisoning or diarrhea. Bedouin tribes also had remedies involving camel dung. They understood, thousands of years ago, that if your internal garden is dying, you need to transplant soil from a healthy garden. It sounds revolting to our sterile sensibilities, but it saved lives. You leave the pharmacy and head to the bakery aisle. You pick up a loaf of white sliced bread. It is soft as a cloud. It lists calcium propionate as an ingredient. That's a mold inhibitor. This bread will not mold for 2 weeks. Your sourdough starter back in the cottage would be horrified. The sourdough was pre-digesting the gluten for you. The bacteria were breaking down the FODMAPs, fermentable sugars, that cause bloating. This modern bread is undigested wheat starch delivered straight to your gut. Is it any wonder that gluten sensitivity is on the rise? We stopped outsourcing our digestion to the microbes and started trying to do it all ourselves, with equipment that hasn't evolved since the Stone Age. You feel a twinge of loneliness. Not social loneliness, but biological loneliness. You are an ecosystem of one. Scientists are now rushing to rewild the human gut. They are freezing samples of poop from uncontacted tribes in the Amazon, hoping to preserve bacterial species that are going extinct in the Western world. We have banks for seeds, the Svalbard Global Seed Vault, and now we have banks for bacteria. We are realizing that Lactobacillus reuteri might be just as important as the polar bear. But you can't just go back. You can't just start eating rotting meat and drinking river water. Your system is too soft. You have lost the iron stomach of your ancestors. If you ate that medieval cheese now, the old whack, you might survive. But you'd likely spend a week on the toilet as your naive gut flora panicked at the invasion. You are trapped in the middle. You have the knowledge of the past, but the biology of the present. So, what do? You buy the kimchi. You buy the kombucha. You buy the fancy artisan sourdough. You try to buy back the heritage you lost. You pay a premium for fermented foods that used to be the food of the poor. You walk toward the checkout. The scanner beeps. Beep. Beep. It is the sound of commerce. But it is also the sound of safety. You know that nothing in this cart will kill you tonight. You won't die of botulism. You won't die of ergot poisoning. You won't die of bloody. You sit down at a low wooden table that stretches across time. On your left is the 13th century. On your right is the 21st. You are the judge, the jury, and the diner at the final feast. It is time to decide, was the struggle worth it? On the left, the pewter plate is piled high with the fruits of your labor. There is the slice of ham, dark mahogany, and glistening with salt. There is the wedge of old whack cheese, crumbling like granite. There is the heap of sauerkraut, pungent and yellow. There is the sourdough bread, heavy as a stone, and a mug of cloudy, thick ale. On the right, a plastic tray sits on a placemat. It contains a microwave dinner, Salisbury steak in brown gravy, mashed potatoes made from flakes, corn kernels that are impossibly yellow, and a brownie that is hot on the edges and frozen in the middle. Next to it is a can of Diet Coke. You take a bite from the left. Crunch. The sensation is overwhelming. The ham fights your teeth. It is incredibly salty, smoky, and gamey. You have to chew it for a full minute to break down the fibers. The sauerkraut explodes with acidity, making your salivary glands ache. The cheese is sharp, nutty, and crystallized, coating your tongue in savory fat. The ale washes it down with a yeasty, earthy sweetness. This food demands your attention. It is loud. It tells the story of the smokehouse, the brine barrel, and the dark cave. It tastes of the soil and the sweat it took to make it. It is high-resistance eating. Then you take a bite from the right. Squish. The Salisbury steak dissolves into a salty, savory paste. The potatoes are smooth, creamy, and taste vaguely of butter flavor number 4. The corn pops gently. The soda is sweet, crisp, and clean. This food asks nothing of you. You could eat it without teeth. You could eat it while watching TikTok. It is low-resistance eating. It is comfort. It is safety. A mainstream historical fact you should know is that the modern palate has infantilized itself. We have effectively eliminated bitter and sour from our daily diet in favor of sweet and salty. In the Middle Ages, sour was a primary food group. It meant safety, acid preservation. Bitter meant medicine, herbs. Today, we breathe the bitterness out of Brussels sprouts and drown the sourness of yogurt in sugar. We eat like giant toddlers. But here is the trade-off. The meal on the left is a nutritional powerhouse. The fermentation has unlocked B vitamins, K2, and enzymes. The glycemic index is low, the fiber is high, but it comes with a side order of anxiety. Did you cure the ham deep enough? Is there a pocket of rot near the bone? Is there ergot in the rye? Every meal is a trust fall with nature. The meal on the right is a nutritional void. It is calorie dense, but nutrient poor. It spikes your insulin, but it comes with a guarantee. You know exactly what is in it. It's printed on the box. You know it won't kill you tonight. You have outsourced the anxiety to the FDA. This brings us to the final scholarly debate, the paradox of choice. Historians and sociologists argue that the medieval peasant, despite his hardships, had a deeper connection to his food because he had no choice. He ate what the season and the preservation method dictated. He was in rhythm with the world. The modern human has infinite choice strawberries in December, sushi in Arizona, but is completely disconnected from the source. We have freedom, but we have lost meaning. We eat food-like substances rather than food, and there is the financial irony. This leads to a quirky fringe tidbit, the peasant premium. If you wanted to recreate the meal on the left today authentic, nitrate-free dry-cured ham, raw milk cave-aged cheese, wild fermented organic sauerkraut, and craft brut ale, it would cost you a fortune. You would have to shop at high-end gourmet stores. The survival food of the poorest serf has become the luxury status symbol of the wealthy elite. We pay top dollar to taste the funk that our ancestors tried so hard to escape. You look at the two plates. If you choose the left, you get flavor, vitality, and a connection to the earth. But you accept the pain. You accept the gnawing hunger of the gap. You accept the toothache. You accept the risk. If you choose the right, you get ease, longevity, and comfort. But you accept the boredom. You accept the sterility. You accept that you are a tourist in your own biological life. You pick up the fork. You hesitate. And then you realize you don't have to choose. Not really. You are the heir to both. You can respect the barrel while appreciating the fridge. You can eat the kimchi and the ice cream. You have the luxury of dipping into the past without being trapped in it. You take a piece of the hard, sharp cheese and place it on the soft, white cracker. You take a sip of the sterile, cold soda. It's a weird combination, but it tastes like victory. You have survived the hunger. You have defeated the rot. You have beaten the botulism. You are the apex predator of the pantry, the master of time and temperature. You push the plates away. You are full. The hunger gap is closed. The winter is over. And now, the feast is cleared away. The long wooden table dissolves into mist, and the smells of the smokehouse and the bakery fade into the cool, clean air of the night. The barrels are sealed. The cellar door is closed. The busy work of survival, the chopping, the salting, the stomping, the boiling is finished. The harvest is safely stored, and the anxiety of the coming winter has melted away. You are back in your own room. The light is dim, casting soft shadows on the walls. The air is still. There is no draft from a thatched roof, no smoke stinging your eyes. Just the gentle, steady comfort of the modern world holding you safe. Feel the weight of your body sinking into the mattress. Your legs, tired from the imaginary stomping of cabbage, are heavy and relaxed. Your hands, scrubbed clean of salt and brine, rest quietly at your sides. Take a deep breath. Inhale the safety of your home. Exhale the worry of the past. You don't need to check